Hello and welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thiel, and this week we continue on in our Torah study with two readings. We have portion from Numbers chapter 30 to 32, then Jeremiah chapter 1 and chapter 2, verse 28, and then Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 to 37. And our second passage is Numbers 33 to 36, which is the end of the book of Numbers. So we're finishing Numbers this week. We have a couple of verses really from Jeremiah chapter 3 and chapter 4, and then two New Testament passages that are from Philippians and the book of James. Now, the reason why we have a double reading this week is because we are celebrating, or at least the Jewish people are celebrating, the fast of Tammuz, Tammuz. It's a period of fasting in which they remember a couple of tragic things from their past. The first one being the day that Moses came down from Mount Sinai and broke the tablets because he saw the worship of the golden calves. And then you have a couple other events related to their captivities, one with Nebuchadnezzar and one with the Roman desecration of the temple in the breaching the walls and stuff in 69 CE or Common Era or AD, whatever you want to say. And so they celebrate that by recognizing an extra holy day or an extra Sabbath day. And so you would have like Friday and Saturday, I believe, being the two Sabbath days of the week. So there's 2 days that are set apart at the end of the week for, fasting and celebrating the Sabbath and not working and recognizing these tragedies. And so you'll see that in the readings as well. There's a theme there with mourning and lamenting and fasting and repentance. And I put on the screen there with our readings a couple of key words that I wanted to make sure we focused on for this week. That was about oaths, we have covenants, we have vows, we have perception, walk, and inheritance. So those are going to be some key terms for us this week. Now, if you look up in a calendar, this whole double Sabbath thing, you might notice that a Hebrew calendar would list this double Sabbath as being the week before this past weekend. And that's because the ministry that I get these readings from, the Lion and Lamb Ministries, they recognize and use the Zadok calendar. You remember we talked about Phineas and his descendants being the priestly descendants that are going to continue on, be the high priest for the temple and serving in the temple. And Zadok was that guy that descended from Phineas and was the high priest during David's time. And so they just believe that, they have a separate, they just look at the calendars and they see the return from Babylon, and they see the current calendar that's used worldwide by majority of people as something that's based on a Babylonian calendar. That's why there's a difference. Either way, that's just how we're looking at it. And with this readings, this is schedule we're on. So this for us is this past week would have been the double portion. So like I said, we're looking at Numbers. We're actually going to be finishing Numbers, and then we have a couple of passages from Jeremiah and from the New Testament. So what I want to do is actually just go in order of the readings for this for the week, like to just look at reading one and then look at reading two, and then we'll wrap up. So just to define some terms, because what we have in Numbers chapter 30 through 32, and really as I was studying all of the passages, realized, the concept of making an oath and making a vow and about covenants was really seen. I saw it throughout all the readings. If you did the readings, maybe you noticed it as well. And so, what I want to start with actually is just defining what these words mean. Like, what's the difference between an oath and a vow? Because what we have in Numbers chapter 30, in verse 2, where our reading starts, it talks about a man making a vow to God, a pledge, and then a woman who makes a vow. And so, what is the difference between having an oath, a vow, a covenant, dedication, so on and so forth? So, I'm getting these definitions from Jacob Milgram in his commentary on the book of Numbers. I've referenced him before. And so, according to Milgram, there are two types of oaths. We're talking about oaths, the assertory oath. And so, that's an oath where someone makes an oath to clear themselves of a charge. So, for example, there's an accusation that's made by a neighbor that they lost their ox and that their neighbor found it and is refusing to give it back. And so, the person who's refusing to give it back could take this assertory no oath and say, I swear before God, I swear to God that I did not take your ox. This is my ox. so on and so forth. The reason why I brought that up as an example is because it's mentioned Leviticus chapter 5, verses 20 to 25. What happens when someone makes an oath like this kind of oath and then breaks it? What's their requirement in terms of sacrifices that have to be made for atonement and forgiveness, so on and so forth. And so there is a whole trial process or a discovery process, and they try to figure out what the truth is. And part of that might have been casting light. The second type of oath was considered a promissory oath, not unlike a promissory note that you might have if you've taken student loans. So, a promissory oath is an oath that imposes an obligation upon the oath taker. So, I'm basically promising to do something, and so I'm making this oath. Now, when you have this oath, it can be taken in two ways. Either one of the oaths, it can be taken in the name of a deity. So that's like swearing by the Lord God, swearing by Adonai, and or swearing to the Lord, which is more of a promise to him. So you can make one of these oaths as a promise to God, or you can make one of these oaths as God as a witness. So that's really what you're doing when you're invoking the name of God into an oath or covenant. Then what you're doing is you're making him a witness in the promise that's being made. And so the promise again could be made to someone else, like I promise, I vow, I swear I did not take your ox, and I swear by the Lord, or I'm swearing in the name of the Lord. I'm swearing knowing that God is watching. And so that's the seriousness or the level of the oath that's being taken. And or you're making a promise to God, like I swear to you, oh God, and he again is a witness because he's one of the parties, like I'm going to do this thing. And so it does have to do with the future, with the promissory oath, like I'm going to do something, and then you're going to experience that as blessing, as how God does it with Abraham. He makes a promissory oath where he says, I will bless you. God says that he's going to make this covenant with him. He makes this promise. That's kind of the idea of an oath. A vow can also be promissory, but usually it's conditional, and it's based on first the person receiving the thing that they want before they give up what they're promising. So the easiest example would be like Hannah, where she says, I will give you my son if you give me a son first. So if you give me a child, I will dedicate this child to you in serving the temple. So that's the difference there with the vow. With the oath, like I swear, again, there you have that one category where it's like I swear I didn't do this kind of thing. And we're gonna look at that again later with Jesus and his teaching in Matthew 5. But then you also have this concept of, okay, I swear by God that I will do this thing. Or I swear to you, God, that I will do this thing. Or God says, I swear by myself that I will do this thing. With a vow, it's I will do this if you do this for me, or if this thing happens. So first the action, and then the act of dedication. And the dedication is always something that's given to the sanctuary. So it could be something like, God, if I get this job, I promise I will give, $1,000 to X ministry because I know that's something you would want, support, whatever. Back in those days, you would only give it to the sanctuary, those vows, those dedications, I should say. And so that it would just belong to them and the priest. Because you're making that vow to God, and ultimately the priests are the ones who kind of take what God, take his portion and use. And then you just have straight dedication. So you can have a vow that leads to dedication, but it is conditional upon receiving something, a favor or whatever. And then you can have just a dedication, and that's where you say, no conditions met. I'm just giving. This is kind of a free will offering kind of thing. I'm going to give this offer. I'm going to make this offer and give it to God immediately. And again, that's to the temple or the sanctuary. So those are the differences there. So what do we have here in Numbers? What we have is some extra laws that are given, and it makes sense leaving out, just finishing out with the previous chapter and recalling all the offerings that are required in the festivals and everything. And you see in the last couple of verses of chapter 29, it talks about your vow and free will offerings, how to prepare them, and there's kind of the summary statement. And so that's given there. And so in addition to those laws, which are also given back in Leviticus, Moses is adding on to these statutes, these ordinances, some extra details, which is needed because again, the people as they're growing have questions, concerns. What about this situation, that situation? We looked at that last week. That issue comes up again with the daughters receiving inheritance. It comes up again at the end of the reading for this week. So in the opening part in chapter 30, which is a very short chapter, you have these different scenarios given out about vows and the requirements for fulfilling them. Now, the first one is about men in verse 2. If a man makes a vow, he is required to keep that vow. Whatever it is he said he was going to do, he has to do it. And I have a verse from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 4. The writer there, the preacher, Kohelet, says, "It is better for you to not vow than to vow and not pay." And so, straight across the board, for all men, it is required that if you make the vow, you have to keep it. There are no exceptions to it. There's no pulling back from it. The reason why it's important is because now in the rest of the chapter, you have a bunch of exceptions being given, and they all are related to women and women making vows in different scenarios. So first you have unmarried women making a vow. It says that if an unmarried woman makes a vow and her father hears her, he has two choices. He can either stay silent, which means that she has to come through on whatever the vow is, or he can speak up and rebuke the vow, or he can speak against it. And in doing so, he's thwarting the vow that is made. He's killing it before it can happen. And so with an unmarried woman, of course, this is going to be a young person, a young girl, ages 13, 14, 15, they're getting married, when they're getting married. So we're talking about a really a young age there. And so we have vows being made by that age group of woman, really a young lady. And so the father has the authority and the responsibility to, in hearing that vow, and the rabbis taught that they have like a 24-hour period. So it's not like, you have to exactly hear the vow as it's made. It's like they make the vow and then the father hears about it within a certain time period, which again is about 24 hours. The father can decide, no, you know what? We're not going to do that. And if that happens, then the vow is forgotten and forgiven by God. And there's no need, I should say, to come through on keeping that vow. And we did look back in Leviticus about, what happens when you don't keep a vow. There's sacrifices to be made, because if God comes through, and a lot of times it does have to do with God. God, if I get this, then I will give you this. And so God comes through, but then the person doesn't come through on their end, then there is a need for atonement made because a promise was made to God. So that's the first category there. The second category is a married woman. Now notice that with the married woman, you have the use of an extra phrase there. It says, suppose she should marry after her vow or a rash promise of her lips by which she obligated herself. So there is an extra, layer of nuance here. You have the idea of a woman who is married making kind of a rash promise or rash decision about something they would do if God would do something for them. And that can be thwarted. And the idea of a rash decision is it's a statement without thinking about the consequences. That's where I got the definition from out of the Hebrew lexicon there. So it's someone who says something and really didn't think out the consequences there of what they were saying. And so in those situations, especially, the husband of that woman can say, no, you know what? We're going to go ahead and cancel out that vow, and then that vow can be canceled out. Remember, none of these things are death penalty worthy. So keeping a vow or or not keeping a vow, there is sin, there's brokenness in a relationship with God, there's a requirement for atonement and for forgiveness and sacrifice and all of that goes along with repairing that relationship. The idea is, do you want to stay on the right side of a relationship with God? This is how you do it. These are the parameters that are given. And then the final example is with a divorced or widowed woman. And the idea here is that, let's say the divorced or widowed woman makes this vow while they are married. It's kind of the concept here. And so they made that vow while they were married, and then they got divorced, or they were divorced, I should say. It wasn't like their choice usually in those days. or their husband died, and so they're still living in their husband's household, then they are still obligated to keep that vow, whatever it is that they made. They have to keep it. It's not nullified. So the boundaries are there. So it says, but if her husband should nullify them, but if the husband nullified them on the day that she made it, then it's okay. It will be nullified. And so there's just the idea. There's like, what happens if the husband dies? Well, if the husband dies, she's still obligated to keep that vow. Then what we have is just yeah, that's actually the end of that chapter, and it just covers that. Now, the obvious question I had, anyway, I thought it was obvious to me, is why do the men get to nullify the vows of women in these different scenarios? And the idea just goes back to their viewpoint on society, the fact that they were a patriarchal society. A lot of societies are that way, and so the idea was that the husband or the father is the head of the household and is their responsibility to know of the law, know of the boundaries, the parameters, the requirements of the law. And while, yes, they could teach their daughters about the law, like we see with the daughters of Zelophehad that we saw last week, and we're going to see again later this week, they knew what the law was as well. So their father taught them, and so that is the responsibility of the father to teach the household the laws and ways of God. We're going to see that when we get into Deuteronomy, which starts next week, and then you get to like chapters 5 and 6, which will probably be in a couple weeks from today. So it is their responsibility to educate their children. So the idea is that, let's say they failed in doing education, maybe they didn't get to that point yet, teaching their daughters about vows, and so that young childhood age, and they make a vow. It's kind of, they don't really know what they're doing. Then the father can nullify it. It's kind of the idea, and that they're the head of the household, and the responsibility falls on them. Maybe they did teach it, but they didn't teach it well, that kind of thing. And then when it comes to a married woman, because she's no longer in her father's household, she's in her husband's household. Again, this is patriarchal, so like the husband is the one who's kind of at the head of the household and making certain decisions and is in charge there. Then the responsibility falls on him as well. And I know, again, this kind of can sound misogynistic in a way, but it ultimately, when you're reading like about the cultures of the time, you realize that women overall weren't protected in a lot of different ways in a lot of different cultures. And so this really was a new way to protect women, just in case there was ignorance in what they were doing or saying. And as if we've seen in previous studies, it was Jephthah, who was a man who made a vow that, he didn't have to make. And when he did make it, he didn't have to keep it the way he did. We've seen that before. So he wasn't well versed anyway. So it's not like men are perfect. Men are responsible, is kind of just the point. And so, like in those cases where women may not be protected because of their lack of knowledge, because of the men failing to give them that knowledge, well, then the responsibility of all that does fall back on the men in the household. So after going through chapter 32, or sorry, chapter 30, we have chapter 31, and we have this story about the revenge or vengeance of God that is now going to be taken out against the Midianites. And remember, the Midianites were the ones who led this charge that resulted in 24,000 Israelites dying because of the joining with idols and with their women, and at the advice of Balaam, which is where we see that reference to here in verse 16, that it was Balaam that that led them to the knowledge of what they could do to make sure that they could harm Israel. And so in this chapter, you have the retelling of the story of how, that happened, and then how Moses is commissioned by God to go ahead and take vengeance on the Midianites for their actions. And like I said, our theme this week is about oath, or making oaths, and about vows. And so part of the oath that God made with his people, part of the covenant, and you look at Leviticus and the cursings and blessings, is this kind of thing where if you engage in idolatry, we're going to have a problem, and you're going to suffer from plague, from pestilence, from famine, from the sword, from beasts of the field. There's going to be all kinds of consequences that come because of your sin. And so that those consequences came. 24,000 people, as I mentioned, have died in a plague that was caused by their idolatry. And so now it is time for God to enact his vengeance against those who led his people astray. And when you read the passage, you see that God looks at the Midianites as being that source, being the source of their error and their sin, and Balaam, and so that's why all these people died. Now, some of the reading can be, a little disturbing. If you did the reading, you see in verse 16, uh, Moses goes to view who's left from the conquering, and I did make note of this, that they caused the death of 24,000 people. Moses got 1,000 people from each tribe to go ahead and fight, and so he goes back at the Midianites with half the amount of people that they caused the demise of through their plan of idolatry and cursing the people. I thought that was kind of symbolic, just to go back at them with half the amount that they end up killing. Because I could imagine the Midianites were like kind of celebrating, like, oh, we killed 24,000 of their people, and we did a great job. Because remember, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to weaken these people so that they could protect their own lands. But Moses was like, yeah, I don't need that many people. I could use half that amount and we're going to have victory. And that's exactly what happens. They kill all the kings. They go in. And so when all the victory happens, what I wanted to mention was verse 17. When Moses sees that there's some people that they didn't kill, he says, so now kill all the boys and kill every woman who's been intimate with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has not been intimate with a man. So Moses sees that they've left some of the people alive, and he's wondering why. And he's like, no, you don't do this. Go ahead and kill them. And when I first read that, I was like, kill all the boys, kill the women. It's like, that's tough to hear. But in the context of what's happening, they used boys and young girls to draw the Israelites out into these practices of idolatry. And how do they do that? And they talked about being intimate with men, and that was with sexual intercourse. And so the the whole trouble here is that they were seduced by both boys and women. So if you read that and you're like, why kill the boys, the young boys? Because they were used in the occult. Now, the phrase there, boys, doesn't necessarily mean boys like 8, 9 years. This means young men that could be, in the age of puberty. So we are talking about people that are like maybe 13, 14, older than that. So it still is troublesome just to think about the cultural kind of influences that are going on there, what the Midianites were into, what they were doing, and how evil that is. And then how the people of Israel that went into that decided to join in with them on that, how evil it was of them to do that kind of thing. And, part of me does feel like, man, it's a 13-year-old boy, probably was poor, a slave. Usually they get put into those kinds of situations. They don't do that like, oh, this is what I want to do when I'm growing up. Or they go to school and they learn about this. They go, yeah, I want to do that. They're kind of usually trafficked into that. They're the poor, taken advantage of. I definitely felt that. If you felt that, like, I wish there was more grace or ability to have grace for those who are younger, who are being used, most likely exploited by those who are older to do these kinds of evil things. I just kind of wish that, but ultimately, this is what the scripture tells us, and this is how we understand it, that they were guilty of helping Israel commit a crime. And so whether or not they were manipulated into doing this thing or not, God, through Moses, is judging these people to death. And so that's what ends up happening. And really, again, the whole concept is about oaths and vows. And this is a big part of the vow and the oath that God took with his people. When you go into the land, make sure you tear down their idols, tear down their detestable practices and all that kind of stuff, and chase out the people, drive out the people. Don't get involved with them, because it's going to be a problem for you later. And we'll look at those verses in a few moments here. So the final portion for the reading number 1 is from chapter 32. And it again kind of looks at the idea of oaths and promises. And what we have here is the tribes of Reuben and Gad. They approach Moses with this idea of settling in the land that they've now conquered. They have grabbed land from different tribes, or different people, I should say, on the eastern side of the Jordan. We've seen that a couple weeks ago. We see later in the book of Judges how the people of Gilead and Gad and Reuben, they are indeed living on that side of the land, or of that side of the Jordan. And so they are enacting an oath, I should say, in this chapter. In chapter 32, they make an oath with Moses, and this oath is about them taking the land that they've taken to be their own. So the way the chapter starts off with, and I don't think I'm going to scroll through all of it because just it takes more time to do all that kind of stuff. But you can see here in verse 5 that the sons of Reuben and Gad, and other Bibles do put Gad first. So it kind of starts off with Reuben and Gad, but then it goes to Gad and Reuben, Gad and Reuben. Reuben, remember, was the firstborn of Jacob, and so he should be mentioned first, but he lost that position. And so the writers of these stories did make a point of eventually making Gad and Reuben in the order of who's being represented here. And we just saw in the last chapter with that the Israeli guy, the Israelite, say that he was the son of Simeon. So the whole first three tribes are a mess with even with the Levites. Even Moses is leading them, but they're all a mess in terms of leadership. And so that's why, if you notice, that is significant that it does switch to Gad to Reuben. Anyway, in verse 5, they say we like the territory we've seized here, and so we don't want to cross the Jordan to go over there and live. Now, Moses' response is understandable. He thinks of them as being like the 10 spies that went into the land and came back and were like, yeah, we don't want to do this. We're scared. The giants are there. We don't want to fight them. And he's looking at them, and it's kind of a reverse situation. Now I've got two tribes that don't want to go into the land. We've got 10 who do, and they just want to stop here. And so he accuses them of thinking this way. He says, your fathers did this when you're to Kadesh. And of course, they were from those tribes where that happened. And so Moses is really upset about this whole idea, but they explain further, listen, what we want to do is we'll build sheepfolds for our livestock, cities for our children. In other words, we want to kind of settle here and set up our families and our animals, but then we will go and we will fight with you. Verse 19, yet we will not inherit with them on the side beyond the Jordan, since our inheritance has come on the east side of the Jordan. So what they're saying is we will go and fight with the rest of Israel, with our brothers, but we won't inherit anything on that side of the Jordan. We'll help them get their lands, and then we want to come back to our lands. So Moses hears this, and he likes this idea. And so he says, if you will do this, if you will help your brothers, your family, your tribe, your nation go and conquer the lands that they need to conquer, you're not going to just stay here and not fight. You're going to fight with us. Then, okay, we can make this deal. After they're done, or after everybody's done getting the land that they need to get, you guys can go back. And so they make this oath. It's necessary now to bring in witnesses into this oath. And so because Moses is going to die, and you see, we saw that, we didn't look at it today, but if you go back to the beginning of chapter 30, you see that Moses is being told, like, this is the final stop for him, that he is going to set up the people for their entry into the land, but he's not going to go with them because of his sin in not following God's order and command in the bringing forth of water from the rock. And so we see that Moses sets up with witnesses, Eleazar, Joshua, and then the chiefs of the fathers of all the tribes, and they go ahead and make this oath about what they're going to do with the land and helping their brothers fight, and then they're going to settle, and they invoke the name of God, and so God is part of this entire deal. One other note to bring up here is that there is kind of a interesting thing that gets thrown in at the end. It says in verse 39, the sons of Manasseh also kind of get involved with this oath, but it's half of the tribe. So half the tribe of Manasseh is part of this oath that they take. So it's Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh who are promising to, take land there now, and then to fight with their family, with the rest of the nation, and only settle back in their land once they're done. And if you read in Joshua chapter 22, you can go see that in your own, write that down. Joshua chapter 22, you see that all the fighting is done, And so Joshua calls these tribes to himself, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe Manasseh, and says, hey, you guys kept your deal. You guys can go back to your land, to your families, to your children, and go ahead and settle in there. And so it closes up like that. But again, why does half the tribe Manasseh get thrown in there? I was like, maybe they heard this and was like, oh, we want to be part of this too. But the consensus with like the commentaries is doing the study, and Milgram did agree with this as well, is that half the tribe of Manasseh is included so that you kind of have this shared responsibility by all 12 tribes. So like the other half has to settle on the west side, and then this one half settles on the east side. So by doing that, the sons of Reuben uh, and sons of Gad, like if they pull out of the deal, it's not only going to just affect them, it's also going to affect I should say 10 tribes, because then half the tribe of Manasseh won't get half of the land that they're supposed to be getting. And so it's really just kind of to motivate the rest of the tribes to continue the fight. And it is necessary because motivation is necessary because they do run into difficulties. Like Ephraim has a really difficult time taking the land that they go after. Caleb has a difficult time dealing with the Jebusites. And in fact, he doesn't fully conquer them. It's not until David where the Jebusites are finally removed and Jerusalem becomes part of their inheritance. So that for us closes our first portion here in the book of Numbers. And so what we want to look at now is our first prophets portion, which is a large portion out of the book of Jeremiah. Not going to cover it all because we just don't have the time for that. But what I want to do is kind of look at some of the core ideas that are here. And again, it's about oath making, it's about covenants, it's about vows. It's what this theme for this first reading anyway is mostly about. And so in Jeremiah, in the first chapter, you read, how Jeremiah is called as a youth, and we've covered that in previous podcasts. And I thought the core verse is here in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 20 reads, "Indeed, long ago I broke your yoke and tore off your bonds." That's God speaking and about how he released them from Egypt and their bonds of slavery. Then he said, "You said, I will not serve." And that's talking about the vow that they took. I will not serve idols. That's Exodus chapter 24, I believe. Yeah, Exodus chapter 24 is where they confirm the covenant and they like, we will do what you say. And remember, it's in the 10 commandments, the very first commandment, going back to Exodus chapter 20, you shall have no other gods before me. And so at the end of all that in Exodus chapter 24, they confirmed that that's the oath they're going to take and that's a covenant they're willing to enter into. And so he says, long ago, I broke your yoke, tore off your bonds. You said, I will not serve. So that he's speaking about what they said in their oath, their part of their agreement. But instead, on every high hill and every green tree, you sprawled out as a prostitute. And so God is saying, you broke your oath, your covenant, your oath that you promised with me, completely broken and shattered with me. And so that's really the context of what we're reading here in the book of Jeremiah out of the prophets portion. And so just a couple of key verses then in Jeremiah to kind of highlight this. Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. It says, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, and the way you followed me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, first fruits of the harvest. All who devoured him were held guilty. Catastrophe overtook them. It is the declaration of Adonai. So that's his part of the covenant, how he protected them, how he brought them out, how they were, special to him and holy to him. And again, highlighting God's perspective in the oath. And then in verse 5, it says, what fault did your fathers find in me that they strayed so far from me? They walked after worthless things, becoming worthless themselves. And then in verse 13, you have this repetition of this idea. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they dug their own cisterns, cracked cisterns that hold no water. And the idea there is that from God, you have this water that's flowing, and it's spring water is also known as living water, major theme of the book of John. Living water, again, is water that has a source that is alive. So it's always just coming forth from there, and it never ends. It's just coming and coming and coming. And there is pictures, there's depictions for us God's throne and how there's this river coming out of it. And so it's just this idea that from God himself, from where he's seated, there is this forever water that is flowing forth from him to water the land to provide life. It's the source of life, this water. And the idea of a digging cisterns and crack cisterns was that, let's say the best place to live is by a river so that you have a living water that's right next to you. In just a practical sense, you live next to the water, you establish your home. Now you've got water there and you can divert it and you can feed your animals and your crops and all that kind of thing. Let's say you settle in a place where there's not a lot of water or living water that's flowing. There's no spring, there's no well, no river. You have to rely on rain. And so you decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and build a cistern. And what they do is they would dig a pit that could hold water. And so they would hope, that it would rain enough to fill the pit. If it didn't rain enough, then you'd have to, fill up jars with water from a well or from a local source like a spring and go and they'd fill up the cistern like they could. And you can imagine then a cracked cistern wouldn't hold the water. And that's what they exchanged God with. It's just this idea that we know where the source of living water comes from, we see it, but because of where we've settled, we don't want to leave where we've settled. We like where we are, we like the situations we're in. We know that moving closer to the source of living water may be a hassle for us, maybe may mean a lifestyle change that we don't want to have to give up certain things about where we are now and to go over there and move there. It's just again just too much work. And so instead, what I'm going to do is find a way to bring that water to me. But eventually, those cisterns crack. What's interesting is that these cisterns that are cracked, these become pits, and these pits become prisons. The first time it's used that way, in that sense, that a pit becomes a prison, is with Joseph when his brothers threw him into a cistern. They threw him into a pit. The pit that they had, where they threw him in there and then they sold him into slavery, that used to be a cistern. And so that's kind of the idea there with cracked cisterns. And so when we try to find our own ways to capture the sources of living water, the best we can do is continue to work hard to bring that water to us and hope that our pit or cistern doesn't crack. Because once it does crack, it's not going to hold water anymore. And then they just become prisons because we become trapped in this cycle where we're relying on our own strength to bring us living water. And that's really what idolatry is. It's relying on your own strength to get this source of living water or whatever it is, this blessing of life from God through the practice of idolatry and, doing things on my own and sacrifices that I think are wise. And remember, those always escalate into the worst of ideas and includes the killing of children and the kinds of sacrifices that God doesn't need or want. So we close out our first portion by looking at our first New Testament passage, and that's from Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 to 37. Now, some historical background. This is according to Barry Kasdan. He said that in the first century, Jewish practice allowed for oaths or promises to be made using spiritual reinforcement. So that's why Jesus says here, don't swear by heaven or by the throne of God or by the earth or the footstool or by the city, the great king or whatever, because that's something that was kind of allowable practice back then, that you can kind of show the seriousness of what you were saying and the promises and the vow you were making by including one of these things into the vow. He even mentions, making vows with your own head. I swear by my life. And in today's language, like I know I've heard people say like, I swear by my mother's grave, or I swear by my child's life. People say those kinds of things because they're trying to make you believe that what they are saying is the most honest thing, that they have all the integrity in the world. They are truthful and they are willing to see their child die if they lie or if they're caught lying by this thing. And in my experience, when I have people swearing that kind of way, what I am really hearing is somebody who has no integrity and they know it. And so they're really grasping for straws. They're trying to prove themselves worthy of being trusted by finding something that they can swear by. And that's really what Barry Kazan explains in his commentary about the background back then, that you had people that eventually, they're making oaths, they're making vows, they're swearing to God, and you're expected to just keep that promise. If you make this vow, you keep this promise. Or you say you're going to do something, you do it, knowing that God is going to hold you accountable. And if you don't come through on it, then there is a system that you can follow with sacrifices for atonement, forgiveness. That was the basic exchange when you look back at the law and in the teachings of Moses. And so you get to a point here where none of that stuff is being taken seriously. Maybe people take promises, they make vows, take oaths, but they don't come through with it. And God doesn't necessarily, like, at that moment, kill somebody, strike them dead. And so overall, people kind of lose respect for the system. That's kind of how I see it kind of growing over time, just this tendency to do that. And so, of course, at some point, someone will say, well, let's swear by the Lord. We'll make an oath that this thing will happen. We'll do this. I'll do that. And someone's like, yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't trust you. He's like, okay, fine. I swear by Jerusalem. I swear by the hairs on my head, my own life. I swear by my own life that this will happen. I swear by heaven, whatever it might be, to try to, again, convince somebody to believe what you're doing or what you're saying or you're promising to say. And so, what Yeshua is correcting at that time, he's looking at those kinds of teachings that don't come from the Torah, they don't come from Moses. They're extra teachings that have been passed along through just culture and through time and have morphed into kind of this path. And so he's correcting that and he's saying, look, don't do that anymore. You've heard people say that you shouldn't do that kind of stuff. And I say, yeah, don't do it at all. This type of swearing, because what we should be focused on is being people of integrity, people that are honest and trustworthy. So that's why he says in verse 37, let your yes be yes, and let your no be a no. And anything more than this is from the evil one. And the evil one, in reference, could be to the devil, Satan. I think it's more understandable to understand, in just in the context, evil one is really a reference to the evil inclination that we have in ourselves, what Paul refers to as the flesh in this context. And so when we have the need, the desire, go beyond just saying, yeah, I'm going to do this, or no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take away your house and everything you have because you failed to pay me. I don't need to make an oath. I can make a promise. I am a man of integrity, a man of truth. People know that, you know that. And so if I say I'm not going to do that, then I'm not going to do that. And so the need to do more than that comes from that part of ourselves that is inclined towards evil, the part of ourselves that lies, that cheats, that's selfish, that's prideful. And so the desire then to, like, prove myself to be trustworthy comes from that fleshly spirit. That's what he means by evil one, I believe, in this context here. And so that's where Jesus is like, yeah, don't do that. Just be a person of integrity and honesty. Remember, he's telling his disciples the kind of people that he expects them to be according to his teaching, his way, and his walk. And so that's kind of the big idea there, is that people will attempt to prove their trustworthiness. And there are ways you can do that with many different vows, but we don't need to overpromise to look spiritual. We can just make sincere promises, make sincere vows. And notice Jesus doesn't say, don't make any vows, don't take any oaths. I don't think that's what he's saying. We do that in our marriage vows, covenants that we take. We promise, and that's the difference there between a covenant and a vow. Again, the vow is conditional. If you do this, I promise to do that. No, a marriage covenant should be by oath. I swear by God, before God as a witness, that I will be faithful to you, so on and so forth. And so it's not conditional. It's just kind of the promise that is made. And again, are you a trustworthy person? And we don't need to try to prove ourselves as trustworthy using these kinds of phrases, trying to prove our spiritual maturity. We should be the kind of people that when we make a promise, when we say we're going to do something, people know we're going to do it. And if we're not that kind of person, that's the part of ourselves that we need to work on. That's the part of our flesh and our evil desires that needs to be fixed and rooted out and changed, conformed into the image of our Lord Jesus as being a trustworthy and honest person. So integrity over appearances would be the goal there. Okay, now we're moving on to reading number 2, portion number 2. That's Numbers 33 through the end of the book of Numbers, a couple of verses out of Jeremiah, and then a couple of passages from the New Testament, one from Philippians and one from James. Now, with our numbers portion, we're going to go a lot faster than we normally do. We're going to skip a lot of the text because we're already at a significant amount of time with the podcast looking at reading number one. And so I want to save time. And so with chapter 33, just a quick summary of what it is. It's a recounting of everything that they've done up to this point, from leaving Egypt to Aaron's death, everything in between and forward. And so it's retelling the story and tells you all the places they camped and stayed. And so if you want to study that and look at that, it's interesting to look at that. We don't, again, have time for all of that kind of in-depth study, but it's all there for us to look at. I think the main point here in chapter 33 is for us to focus on verses 52 to 56. And it's about the covenant terms that need to be focused on with the people of Israel. Okay, so now they're going to enter into the land. What is it that you need to do now? God is bringing you in. What are the expectations? And these are those. Number one, drive out the inhabitants of the land. Notice it doesn't say to kill everybody. It says to drive them out. And I've mentioned this before. You go back to the book of Exodus. God always said that he would be the one to drive them out. He would send a hornet before them. The people would flee. They would actually abandon their cities. And this would be a progressive thing as they go into the land. The people would leave a city. They would take over it. And then they were supposed to destroy all the idols that they find there, all the altars, everything associated to the worship of other gods. They smash those things. And so they don't have to fight the people. The people get driven out of fear, again, because God is the one who's doing that. You can look that up in the book of Exodus. They take possession of land. They settle in it. They start to grow. When they start to get to a certain number, then they're going to move forward into the land and expand. And God said the reason why is because he wanted to make sure the land doesn't become fruitless with, just everybody being chased. Now it's going to become desolate. Wild animals take over. And so he wants us progressively move the people out. And so as they do that, they have success. There's not a lot of fighting going on. It's God driving the people out. And so God's going to use his people. He's going to use his angels. He's going to use his power to do all that kind of stuff. And again, it's judgment on these nations for the idolatry that they have engaged in. Like we looked at the Midianites and the kinds of ways that they exploited young children into their worship practices. Once they do that, they divide the land by lots, and then they all go and settle in where they're supposed to be. Now, failure to do that kind of thing. Verse 55, you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land, where whoever you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your side. And so we're talking about covenant terms and about oaths and promises and vows. This is what God is saying. Like, you have this responsibility. Drive them out. If the people don't go, you do what you need to do to get them out. They have to go. They have to go. Don't let them stay there. Why? Because if they do stay, they will harm you. And how will they harm you? Like I just read, barbs in the eyes, thorns in their side. Eyes in scripture is about perception. We look at body parts and how they're described and used in scripture, even with Jesus' teachings. Pluck out the right eye. He wasn't saying to remove your right eye from your body. No, he's talking about the perception that you have. And it's the right eye. It's the perception that you keep power with. He wants you to remove that because that's the thing that's leading you to the sin that you're struggling with. The perception has to be taken out. And so eyes have to do with perception. And so if they're going to be barbs in your eyes, that means the perceptions, the way of seeing things, how they perceive things are going to be just in trouble. They're going to be damaged. They're going to be hurt. It's going to be problematic. It's going to cause them pain. Right? You think about a barb in your eye, like a thorn in your eye, that's painful. And so your perceptions are going to lead to your pain. That's what he's saying. And ultimately what that is and what that means, how we can see that practically applied, is that you're going to fail to see that your worship of other gods is actually truly prohibited, because by allowing them to stay in the land, you're going to see them continue to worship their God. And as they worship their gods among you, you're going to be like, hey, look at them. They're doing that and everything's okay. Why can't I do that? I remember that God. I want to do that God. That God looks cool. Look at their lives. I want to get involved with that. And so the perception is being hurt. It's being damaged by not completely driving them out and destroying their idols and their high places and all that, which is part of the driving out process. And so that will lead to compromise. which leads to a failure to understand the danger that they're in, to perceive the danger. Because we saw in Jeremiah that eventually becomes, okay, we're going to just worship this God instead of our God. And God judges, and they have a terrible time as a result of their idolatry and their sin. So, perception is the first thing. The second thing is thorn in their side. There's going to be a pain in their side. And the side is a reference to the body in general and how we walk. If you have a pain in your side, if you haven't been running in a while and you go running, you're breathing in hard and you start to feel that pull on your lungs and the side, like, oh my gosh, my side, pain in the side makes it hard to now walk, run, to play. You're like, you're okay. You're like, oh yeah, you're taking deep breaths. I need a minute. You step out from whatever activity you were doing. And that's what's being referenced here. A thorn in the side is something that affects your walk or your ability to walk straight, to walk in a way that God wants you to walk. And so you have an ongoing irritation, interference, a disruption in daily life. So you're living your life, you're trying to worship God, but then you see that person who's there also worshiping another God, and so you start to wander. You start to walk into their pathways instead of staying on the path that God has established as his own. It'll be a consistent threat. So it's not just like fatal right away, and that it's, as soon as you fail, no, it's going to be always there. That's the idea of the thorn in the side, is this kind of perpetual problem that you're going to have to deal with. And it's going to impact their mobility, their peace, their stability. And so that's because that's what a thorn in your side is going to be like. You're not going to be able to sit comfortably, move around comfortably. You're always going to have danger around you. And that was part of the covenant God made with his people, is as long as you do what I say, drive the people out, destroy their idolatry, everything related to their idolatry, then you're going to have peace around you. The animals that are around you aren't going to bother you. The enemies around you aren't going to bother you. You're going to have peace. And so by having the thorn on the side, by leaving the people there, by allowing them to remain in their lands, it's going to affect how they walk. So that's the close of Numbers chapter 32. Now, those are two main ideas we're going to focus on now. It is about the oath and the covenant, but if exactly like in terms of how the breaking the oath will affect the lives of the people, and that's in perceptions and walk, and also related to inheritance. So in chapter 34, what we have is a description of all the boundaries that God is establishing for the people and for the land they're about to take. So I do have a map here that we can look at. And so you can see the boundaries here. And it is kind of squished down because of how I have the slide set up here. But these are all the boundaries of land that they're going to have, going down south to this point and going up north to this point here. The Sidon, Tyre being the upper levels there. And then you have Kadesh Barnea being that southern boundary, the western boundary being the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern boundary being the edge of the land that belongs to Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh. And then for chapter 35, you have the cities of the Levites. So if you remember, the Levites don't receive any land as an inheritance. They instead get 48 cities throughout the land. And so that's what you see here represented with the dots and all the names there. Some of the more famous cities like Shiloh and Hebron. And then they see Tabor in the north. And you have on the eastern hand side, you have 3 cities that have this plus mark sign, and on the western side you have another 3 cities with that plus sign, and those cities are the sanctuary cities. The 48 cities in total, 6 total are sanctuary cities, 3 on each side. So there's an even split for these people. And a sanctuary city, when you read Numbers chapter 35, you see it's about murder. You remember, murder can be avenged by someone's family. And so if you killed somebody and you wanted a chance to at least plead a case, the only option you had was to run to the nearest sanctuary city. You got there, you went and saw the priest that was there, because these were cities belonging to Levites, and then the blood avenger would come. The blood avenger would be the family member whose responsibility is to get a vengeance for the blood that was spilled. And then there was a whole legal process to follow there. what God said was, and you can see that in Numbers 35, anybody who is truly guilty of murder, something they planned out, something, it's like first degree murder, that kind of thing, intentional murder, was guilty. And so the blood avenger was allowed to take vengeance because God does not want the blood of innocent people to pollute the land. That's kind of the idea with murder there. And if you've been with us since the beginning, you know this is an established kind of process for God, going back to way back to Noah and separating kind of the timelines between before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, people could do whatever they thought was right in their own eyes, including committing murder, and then nobody was getting vengeance on them. And so the blood of those who'd been murdered would pollute the land because there was nothing to cover that act of sin from rising up and being a stench before God. And so after the flood, Noah is given a new set of laws, a covenant, a new set of laws, and part of that laws is the idea that if someone commits murder from now on by men, and in this case with Israel with the blood avenger, their blood shall be spilled, so that it's eye for an eye, vengeance is taken, the murderer is put to death. And so that way, that kind of cycle that happened before the flood that led to the flood doesn't happen again. And so that's what's laid out for us in Numbers chapter 35, and the idea of a sanctuary city. Now, what is also mentioned in that chapter is that if a person is not guilty of intentional sin, like it was something that was an accident, then they could remain there, and they become basically lifetime servants for the Levites or the priests. So the high priest dies and they were able to be set free, but they were indeed, their lives did change. The fact that they were guilty of murder, and that happens here, even in our country in the U.S. If you're guilty of manslaughter, it's not like, oh, it was an accident. It's still called manslaughter. There maybe not the death penalty, but there are consequences for that. And I know I've mentioned this before. The death penalty is not a straightforward kind of subject nowadays. In those days, you were depending on a proper trial, God being involved, God being heard through the Urim and Thummim, the whole thing, the priests we talked about they could cast lots and they could get answers from God. And so guilt was a known thing. Like if someone was guilty, this wasn't a question. There weren't any questions about it. In our country today, there are many, many cases of people who are convicted of murder and they sit on death row for years, and then DNA evidence comes out. It's like, oh, they're innocent. They didn't have anything to do with it. And what happened there? You have juries that are skewed, that are biased, that are straight up racist sometimes. And so what they do is they convict a man based on nothing other than the words of others and maybe even their own hatred. And those people get put onto death row and they're completely innocent. And that's why there's a lot more nuance about that whole position and whether or not the death penalty should be allowed. According to scriptures, again, if everything was perfect, if people were perfectly convicted, there were no problems with the system, then yeah, that's what was going on here with this system in the scriptures. But that's not what we have here in our world today. And of course, you can see that with the Lord Jesus, with his sentence and his trial. You can see that people wouldn't have fair trials. And in fact, when you read the prophets, whether it's the dozen like Joel and Amos, or Isaiah, Jeremiah, the bigger ones, you see that there wasn't justice, there wasn't fairness, there was a huge amount of bribes being taken and judges ruling in favor of those who want money and want inheritances, and including putting people to death who were innocent. So that whole system again became problematic. You're looking at these passages with this in view, that you're trying to set up God's ideal version of what his nation would look like. I don't want people committing murder, but if they do, this is the way we're going to deal with it strictly. Okay, so now we close out with our final portion here in Numbers chapter 36. I mentioned this before. We had the daughters of Zelophehad. In last week's reading, they went to Moses and they said, hey, listen, our dad died in the wilderness. And so he had an inheritance, but it's going to be passed along to who? Our uncles, our cousins, some other guy. Like, we're not going to get it. It's not fair. Moses went to God and God said, yeah, they're right. Just because they're girls, because they're daughters, doesn't mean they shouldn't get the inheritance of the land. And so God set up a new system with Moses saying, okay, now the daughters get to receive the land. But in the beginning of chapter 36, you have another issue brought up related to this issue, and that was brought up by the tribe of Manasseh. Remember, Joseph is split into two tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, and they bring up this point and say, hey, listen, our brother Zelophehad had daughters, and you said the land will go to them. But what if they become wives of people from different tribes? Like, let's say they marry someone from Judah and someone from Simeon and someone from Gad, Dan, Asher. Now the land that they received that is supposed to belong to our tribe is going to go to another tribe because it goes to their families now. It's not right. They didn't feel like it was right. And God again looks at that. Moses brings it up to God, and God looks at it and says, okay, you know what? They have a point. They're going to lose inheritance. And overall, like in Jubilee and stuff, like this stuff's not going to be set free because it's really technically just going to belong to the tribe of the husbands and whoever it is that these daughters marry. And so what they come up with is, okay, have them only marry within the tribe. Now they end up marrying, it says their uncle's sons and then marrying their cousins. Okay. But there probably are more people, other families. They're probably okay with that. But that's what they end up doing. But the idea was, again, we're going to kind of have a fair way of dealing with this issue. And God is okay with that. And we're going to keep the tribes with getting the inheritance that they're due. And that's really the idea and the theme that I was thinking about, is that the inheritance that is due to a person, it's important to God that they receive what they are supposed to receive. The inheritance that is theirs is theirs. That's part of God's like covenant with the people, is that he is going to give them this land. And even with all their failures, God knows all their failures. We've seen it already. He's still faithful in making sure that the right people get the right inheritance at the right time. And that's going to apply to us as well as we look at Philippians in a few minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look on to the second prophets portion, which again is only a couple verses from Jeremiah. I want to focus on chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. As if you will return, O Israel, return to me, declares the Lord. If you will put your detestable things out of my sight, then you will not waver. You will swear, as the Lord lives, you'll have a new oath you'll take, and the oath that you make with God will be one that's taken in truth, in justice, and in righteousness. And the nations will bless themselves in him, and in him they will glory. And remember, this is the second reading of this Sabbath celebration of the fast of Tammuz, or related to the fast. Remember, the fasting is related to all of these tragedies that have happened on this specific day, at least in their history and their tradition, going back to Moses and the golden calves and him breaking the tablets, to the Romans breaching the walls. All these like terrible things happen on the same day, or it's commemorated to be in the same day, same time frame. And so they fast and they mourn. And so part of that fasting, part of that mourning is, okay, what does God want from us? Return to him. Have this new oath taken with him, and have that new oath that's taken him in him or with him by him be an oath of truth, be an oath of justice, be an oath of righteousness. And we've considered these things before, but even looking at our passage this week, like for God, justice, dealing fairly with people is important. That's why he looked at the concerns the daughters of Zelophehad and he corrected that issue, and then the concerns of Manasseh and the whole tribe in general in terms of inheritance. For God, it's important that justice is a characteristic of his nation, his people. And so he wants a new oath to be taken with justice in view, with truth in view. How does God walk? How does God see this world? We saw that back in Micah chapter 6. Walking humbly with God means to know God's truth and to accept his truth, his perceptions of things, his reality, and to realize that truth is his truth and to obey them and to even form your life based on that truth. And then righteousness is about the right actions towards those around you, whether it's caring for the poor, caring for the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. Those things matter to God. And so he wants the oath that they're going to take, the new oath they're going to take in repentance, in their fasting and mourning, to have these characteristics to be a part of them. And so just like we looked at with Jesus as he's looking at his disciples, he's like, I want you to take these promises and take these oaths. You're going to swear. I want you to just be faithful people of truth and integrity. That's what matters to me. Now we look at our final two portions that come from the New Testament. We have Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 to 21, and then James chapter 4, verses 1 through 21. So what we have here are kind of the same ideas being addressed, ideas with inheritance and ideas with things to be look out for, the dangers that can afflict our eyes, our perceptions, and our walks. So first I want to look at the dangers that are addressed. So in Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 to 21, the primary danger that is addressed by Paul, and this is also the danger that is addressed by James, is about pride. Pride being something that can ruin our perceptions and our walk. Now, for Paul, in this chapter here, in this context with Philippians, he is looking specifically at the kind of pride that comes from one's own abilities, their own actions, and how they can unlock righteousness in their own ways by their own deeds. And so he recalls how he himself has obtained all of these things, righteousness in the highest of heights. It's going back to the opening part of the chapter, so outside of what was assigned. But you see there, he's talking about himself and how he was circumcised on the 8th day. So he wasn't someone who converted later on in life. He was someone who was born a Jew, circumcised on the 8th day as he's supposed to be circumcised. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews. According to the scripture, he's like a Pharisee. So he's very intimate with the law, knows the law extremely well. He studied it all his life, and he has all this confidence. And with zeal, talked about zeal last week, he had the best of all zeal. He persecuted those who violated the law and his understanding of the law. And so he's like, all of that, I could be found blameless. Like he's like, I could be the proudest person in the world. But all of those things, and he admits later, his zeal was wrong, but all of those things are things that could just be garbage to him. Why? Because in light of who Yeshua is, there's no room for that kind of pride. There's no room for someone to look at even all of those proud moments of accomplishments related to his ethnicity and his history and his identity as a Jewish person, as a true Israelite. Like none of that matters, because what actually matters is the righteousness that Yeshua accomplished by going to the cross. And remember, Yeshua's righteousness accomplished by going to the cross is a righteousness of obedience and self-sacrifice and love. It has nothing to do with pride, has nothing to do with arrogance, has nothing to do with strength or ability or power. In fact, it has everything to do with humility. That's actually what Philippians is about. If you've studied the book, you know in Philippians chapter 2, how he humbled himself, how Yeshua humbled himself. And so he describes people, the people that are kind of the people he's contending with, he's having to deal with, that are teaching those he's writing to different things, trying to tell them to focus on things like circumcision, focus on keeping the law, focus on the perfect Jewishness they can obtain even as Gentiles. He says for them, their gods is their own desires, which comes from their belly. So they're just hungry people that want to satisfy themselves. And that's what we've talked about earlier with idolatry and these barbs that are going to hurt your perception, your walk. When you go based on what is going to satisfy me, you're willing to go as far as sacrificing children to get what you want. That's the extreme, but that's the ultimate goal. And that's what happens even here in the US. Like we could make laws, we could protect children better, but for our own freedom, our own sense of freedom, we won't do that. And so if we sacrifice a few children here and there, oh well, at least I get to keep my rights and my power and my strength and what I want. That's how it's playing out. You can see it happen here in the real world as well. So it's not just something that happened then in the Bible and thousands of years ago. And so they are concerned with earthly things, these people. And again, this is kind of the idea, earthly things, pride, going after your own desires. These are the dangers that Paul is warning the church in Philippi about. And that is the key here to understand by looking at these verses and how they connect with the rest of our passage, because God warned the people hey, if you're not careful, they remain there. You don't allow, get them out of there. They're going to become barbs in your eyes, and they're going to become thorns in your sides. Affect the way you walk, and they're going to affect the way you see things. And so Paul is addressing that issue there in the book of Philippians. Now, what James is referring to or referencing is the same idea. He's referring to pride again. And I remember only recently in just studying James and looking at Jude and studying the book of Obadiah, how much of all of those books are really just about one concept about pride and how pride is our downfall. And what we get to when we get to chapter 4, he says, you have a lot of problems in your walk. And you can kind of look at Philippians being more about the perceptions, about how you see the cross of Yeshua, how you see yourself, his work versus your work, your inheritance and what really your inheritance is, and how your perceptions about yourself can really take away from your inheritance because you're going to end up relying on yourself rather than what Jesus has done for you, what Yeshua has done for you on the cross, the example that he has set, and then the inheritance that comes through faith in that work and what he has done. If we look at James chapter 4 and kind of separating the two between perception and walk, this is about the walk. And what their walk was about was sin, and it was about pride. You can see kind of summarized there. I've got a list there. People are walking with quarrels, with conflicts, unsatisfied cravings, with murder, with envy, with wrong motives. They have committed adultery because they have joined themselves with the world, and then they've become enemies of God. And that's the same kind of language that is used about idolatry, joining in with the world and committing adultery against the one that you've made a covenant with the one who is your God. And the root problem of all this is pride. Because you see in verse 6, he gives greater the grace. Therefore, he says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And he says, submit to God, resist the devil, he will flee from you, draw near to God. Again, I think devil there may actually refer to the evil one, which is about the flesh and about the evil desires that we have, the pride that we have that leads to the quarrels and the conflicts. So if we submit to God, we can resist those evil inclinations. We can resist them in a way that they will then flee from you, flee from us. We can see it as the person of the devil himself. I kind of see both but I focus more on my own evil inclinations because sometimes we kind of make the devil so powerful, like, oh, he's the reason I did something I shouldn't do, when really comes down to I did what I wanted to do, and now I'm trying to pass the blame on to the devil and like God, oh, the devil got me, and really not be accountable. And so I don't want to do that. I look at myself and I say, okay, this is about me. And so I submit to God. And so when you look at that in terms of pride, submitting to God, humility means letting go of your pride. Your pride is what's leading to the quarrels, to the conflicts, to the envy, to the unsatisfied cravings. You need to let that stuff go. You need to let your pride go, submit to God, humble yourself before God. He will draw near to you, cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts. Those are all references now to what the Spirit of God does. Remember in Leviticus, that's water, there's washing, there's cleansing, there's purifying. 7 days outside the camp, there are always restrictions, but in the New Testament, after the work of Yeshua and his resurrection, now we see that the Spirit of God is the thing that washes us. It washes us, it cleanses us, it purifies us. And so in drawing near to God, we will be cleansed because his Spirit will begin to pour out into us. And we learn that that's also the spring of life that is referred to throughout the scriptures. That's John, the Gospel of John, John chapter 7, I believe 38, 39, refers to the Spirit of God being that living water. And so he cleanses us. He purifies us as we draw near to God. We resist our selfish motives and desires. And he says, lament and mourn and let your laughter be turned into mourning. And so what the Jewish people are doing is they collectively, mourn together and think about all the past and everything that they've gone through. The same idea is there. Like when you humble yourself before God, you are expected to bring yourself down. And I think that's missing in Christianity today is this real sense of repentance, because a lot of times, like, we turn repentance into these quick little statements of, oh God, I'm sorry, forgive me. your quiet time, private, "Oh, I feel really bad." And you get up, you walk in and say, "Okay, I'm forgiven." And where is the expression though of grief? James, this is a New Testament writer, is saying, humble yourself, let your laughter be turned into mourning, let your joy be turned into gloom. Mourn, fast. And Jesus said, when you do this thing, don't show off, like don't let people know that you're mourning and you're in gloominess. I once fasted for 40 days. I didn't do a complete fast. I did a they call the Daniel fast, but it was still tough on me. It was really hard on me to do that. But and spiritually, there was just a lot of stuff that was going on. I was dealing with depressive episodes and anxiety and fear and loneliness. There was all kinds of just garbage in my life that I was dealing with. And so that was what was motivating me to do that and to try that as a way to draw near to God. And I really did, because in those times where I really wanted to get a hamburger, or I really wanted to go get fried chicken, or I really wanted to, eat anything that wasn't lettuce, I would just open up the scriptures and I would read, and then I would pray, and then I would worship, and I would draw near to God, and I could feel his presence there, and I knew his spirit was there. And while I went out, I took my showers, like I cleaned up. People are like, "Oh, are you dieting?" I never let on that I was struggling. Like when we went out to eat, "Oh, we're gonna have wings." Okay, yeah, yeah, let's go get wings. And I was just getting, "Oh, okay, I'm not eating right now." Sometimes I didn't want to lie, so I just be like, "Yeah, just so you know, like I'm not eating certain foods." So, well, like, I'm a big deal about it, and people respected that. And what Jesus was really referring to about not letting people see these outward shows of righteousness was how there were those who would do these things so that they would be noticed. Like, I'm fasting and I want you to know I'm not going to take a shower. I'm going to put, ashes on my face. And he's like, don't do that kind of thing. And so I think in all of that, sometimes there's confusion in the church. People are like, to me, it kind of sounds like Jesus is like, don't do it. And so I won't. And that's not at all the idea. The idea is that when we sin, when we have our pride as our problem, especially, and we want to draw near to God, and whatever it is that's afflicting us, and we want to correct our perceptions, we want to correct our walks, and we realize that we need to do that, then we need to draw near to God. And drawing near to God comes through the practice of fasting and true repentance. Because again, as you deny yourself, you're using those opportunities where you are denying yourself to reach out to God. Like I said, when I wanted something like that I knew I was abstaining from, I would go to God, and it would be morning. It'd be, God, I just have all these problems. Selfish. I'm just not a good person. I think about myself just way too much is usually like kind of the cause. I don't want to be like that. I want to focus on you. I want to focus on your kingdom. That's true repentance, is noticing how you fell short of his requirements, his standards, his perceptions, his truth, his walk, confessing that to him. And the length of time, I mean, I think you go with the spirit on that. Some people fast for a day, 3 days, a week, and do the 40 days, whatever it might be. Use wisdom in your preparation and your approach to those kinds of things. But I think it's really key for overcoming sin. Not that you're like gaining power over it. No, it's that you're really drawing close to God. You're really showing yourself and him how much it means to you that you messed up and that you want to get right. And then in drawing near to him, what happens? The evil part of you flees. And I'm not at all perfect, but I can tell you that since I'm 28, no depression, none of that like loneliness, none of that me kind of stuff. Like, man, I'm a completely different person. My wife could tell you that. Anybody who knew me from there, really knew me from before that moment to after that moment, knows that there has been a significant change in my life. And I put it at that point where I really drew close to God and was finally cleansed from all those things that I just needed to be. And so our final theme here is with inheritance. We're going to go back to Philippians chapter 3, and you're just, you're looking at these passages. I was looking at it and seeing they get this land, they get these pieces of property, and that's great. That's their inheritance. So what exactly do I get? And just looking at Philippians chapter 3, we see what we get, what our inheritance is. Paul says the citizenship is in heaven. Uh, and from there, we eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord, Yeshua, the Messiah. He will transform this humble body of ours into the likeness of his glorious body through the power that enables him even to put all things in subjection to himself. So, what do we inherit? Well, first of all, our citizenship, or like the land that we inherit, if we want to think about our inheritance, is in the place that God dwells. I know that the portion here says in heaven. When you look at the Greek phrase, you look at do the exegesis, the Greek phrase that's translated to the word heaven is really just means the dwelling place of God. It also can mean the sky, the dwelling place of God. So Paul is using that phrase because he's writing in Greek. But in Jewish eschatology, Paul is undoubtedly referring to the promise of God dwelling on earth with his people, his dwelling place being on earth. And so, what I really believe what Paul is saying here, first of all, is our citizenship, where we are going to live, is in the place where God dwells, wherever that is. Right now in our timeline, God has his own timeline. Right now in our timeline, we are here on earth and God is in that place he dwells. We call it heaven, but it's not in the sky. It's not like up somewhere. We know the space is up. We can go launch a rocket no up, not north, but up, and we'll end up in space. That's not where God is. God is in his dwelling place, which you can think of more as being a different dimension. Anybody who's watched like, Stranger Things or really any other kind of sci-fi things, you kind of get the idea. You have like alternate dimensions. You got a portal to go through somewhere to get there, and alternate worlds, that kind of thing. And so really God's in his own dimension, one that we can't access on our own. And so that's his dwelling place. And so our citizenship is there with him in his dwelling place. But ultimately, in Jewish eschatology, the Jewish hope, the final hope, and I think what Paul is talking about, is when we all with God will dwell here on earth with his dwelling place being there at the place that he is appointed to be his own. Zion. That's the dwelling place. So that's where our citizenship is. So if you're reading those passages and you're like, well, what do I inherit? Because you can read Ezekiel also, and you can see that all the tribes, they get different portions of land. I think it's proportioned differently than what we see, leading up to in Numbers and leading up to their actual conquest. They get a different division there. Levites, what they get. But for those of us who are now in the New Testament era and followers of Yeshua, believers of him, what do we get? We also have a citizenship there. So we have rights to live there. I don't know where the land is going to be exactly a dwelling place. My idea is that we're going to be functioning closer to the center where God is. So that's just my idea. Oh, and then also, what else is our inheritance here in verse 21? He will transform the humble body of ours into the likeness of his glorious body. So something I used to tell my students, I've told my daughter, my wife, I've talked about it, anybody really, is you think about all the stuff that Yeshua was able to do with that new body that he had after his resurrection. How he could like walk through walls. Remember, the disciples had locked themselves into a room and he's there. He was able to just transfer up into heaven, go to be with God and come back. How he was able to, walk on water. Well, okay, that was before, but I think that's part of that glory that he could have, he could do. Just all of those kinds of aspects, kind of things he could do after his resurrection, the glorious body, and even before the resurrection, like all the miracles he could do, the transfiguration, like everything related to that and what his body could do in the glory, in the fullness of glory that it had. So even performing the miracles, which I don't know if how you needed that is, but whatever. We get that as an inheritance. But these humble bodies, these bodies of our humiliation, some translations say, these bodies that show that we're broken people, basically, that we can be, we can be prideful and everything else, but the moment you get up after not drinking enough water, you get dizzy and you fall over, like those bodies, these bodies that humiliate us, when I sit down, I'm like, oh, and people know, wow, you're getting old. Those bodies get transformed into the body that he had, that likeness and that glory. So that's another part of the inheritance that we have. Really cool. And that happens to the power that's enabled him to put everything into subjection. That's the power that's given to him by the Father. And so that's how I want to close out this week's readings. I know it was a lot of stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Again, as always, please like, subscribe. If you got any comments, please put them in the comments below so we can have a discussion going on. If not, Oh, well, I'll see you next week. Thank you for watching. God bless.